Welcome to Thirsty Thursday. Lovely to have you here today. Before I jump into it again, as usual, just to run through a bit of housekeeping for everyone. We can't see you or hear you, so the way to connect with us, ask questions, etc., down the bottom of the screen is the little Q&A toggle. Just press on that and I will attempt to answer as many of them as possible. Generally, we just talk and the questions will be hopefully answered at the end of it, but we will answer them along the way if they're pertinent to what we're saying. So without further ado, I'm joined tonight by three legends of the Barossa. We've got Caroline, Nigel and Stewie. I will introduce Caroline first of all, and then we can talk to the other guys. So Caroline, how are you tonight?
Hi, I'm good, thank you. Hi, angels. It's great to have everybody online. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, all good. I'm actually on holidays at the moment down at the beach, so
lucky you.
So yeah, I'm having a good time.
So could you just give all the angels a bit of an introduction as to who you are and how you got started in winemaking and why you got into winemaking?
Yep, sure. So I actually have two different brands on Naked Wines. So there's one that I do myself, which is read by Caroline Dunn. And then there's also the one that I do with Nigel, who you'll talk to in a minute. And that's Dolan Dunn. So we got a couple of brands. It's all Barossa. Oh, well, there's a little bit of Blanc Creek as well, but it's mostly Barossa. We're both based in the Barossa. And I got into winemaking, I guess, as a bit of a second career. I started off in restaurants and hospitality, and I grew up in Sydney. And I decided I wanted to get into the wine industry somehow, and left my job in a restaurant in Sydney. And within a couple of days, a friend of mine who worked up in the Hunter in a winery there said, "Do you want to come up for vintage and come up for a long weekend?" And my long weekend became 6 weeks, and I just fell in love with it. Loved getting dirty and digging out red fermenters and things like that. So that was kind of the start of it. And then moved down to South Australia and to study winemaking, and then moved up to the Barossa after I finished, and been there ever since. So yeah, it's a great place in the Barossa, love it, and not planning on going anywhere else terribly soon. So yeah, good. That's how I got into it.
Nice. And so it was just a reason you wanted to get out of hospitality, find something else to do, and it just clicked.
Yeah, I guess I'd always been interested in hospitality, but I wasn't really passionate about it. But while I was working in restaurants and things, I was putting together all the wine lists, and so I got to know a lot more about wine while I was doing that, and learn a lot about different wines and taste lots of wines and all that sort of thing. So I sort of thought, oh, this is, I'm much more passionate about that than I was about actually running restaurants, and so yeah.
And can you talk to some of the wineries that you've worked for in the Barossa?
Well, when I first started winemaking, I was in the Hunter, and I was working with Brokenwood. And then when I moved down to South Australia, I actually started working down there at Chapel Hill in McLaren Vale. And then I moved from Chapel Hill up to Wolf Blass in the Barossa, and I worked with Wolf Blass for about 15 years all up, and then left there to do my own thing, basically. Yep. So, yeah.
And any mentors? I'm sure there would have been a couple, but any ones that you want to mention or talk about?
Well, I guess the first person who really introduced me to winemaking was Ian Riggs at Brokenwood. So he's certainly been a bit of a mentor of mine, and Pam Dunsford down at Chapel Hill. And Nigel, I worked with Nigel for many years at what was originally, when I started there, Mildara Blass, which then became Beringer Blass, and is now, then was Foster's and now Treasury. So yeah, Nigel was working at Saltram. So we used to, work quite close together quite a lot through that time. So yeah, Nigel was also one of my mentors for sure.
Yeah. I suppose that's a pretty good segue to over to Nigel. How are you, Nigel? Do you want to?
You see that one?
Sorry,
Yeah.
mate, go for it.
Hi, Angels. Good to be here. I'm in the Barossa. Caroline's on holidays. I'm working. All good.
So, again, can you give a introduction? How you got into winemaking and why you got into winemaking?
Sure, mate. I'll try and keep it brief. Essentially, I came from a winemaking family. My father was a winemaker, so I grew up. That was the start. My childhood memories are around wineries and vineyards. We didn't own vineyards or winery, but my father was involved. So many memories of just kicking around with my brothers and other children around wineries. And I guess it just became ingrained. A lot of that was just through osmosis. And my first job was when I was at uni in Celador, just to earn some money. That kind of kindled the fire a bit. Led into attending Roseworthy, which was the old school way of getting them into the career. Got through there, and then started working the Barossa, and that's 42 vintages ago.
Wow.
So yeah, and I've done vintages elsewhere, including one in the Hunter. But yeah, I've been basically in the Barossa for the entire career. Yeah, it's been fabulous. I really like Caroline. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
Yeah,
this is a winemaking. My roots are here, and there's still a lot happening. That's provides a satisfying career.
Yep. And so Caroline mentioned you guys work together. Can you tell us a little bit more about that time?
Yeah, well, I was hoping you wouldn't ask me what wineries I had worked for in the Barossa, because it might be easier to ask me who I haven't. And largely that's an issue of my career spanning through the 80s and 90s, when the industry went through quite turbulent times and corporate takeovers and really just sitting in one place, you could be moved all over the place, if that makes sense. Sure. And as Caroline said, through an early career at Seppeltsfield, where I learnt the craft of fortifieds, which was a great pleasure in terms of my winemaking career. Then into Saltram for 17 years, where I learned a lot about management, more about vineyards in that time, and ultimately about fine Barossa wines. And through that phase, yes, there was different ownerships through the Beringer Blast, then Foster's period. It led me into roles with Wolf Blass and indeed Penfolds. So yeah, it became quite a corporate journey for a while. But I've moved on from that and back into more grassroots in more recent years, to the current situation with the partnership with Caroline, Dolan and Dunn, which is very much more grassroots. Yeah,
and we talk about it as the you guys coming back together and bringing the band back together, so to speak.
Absolutely.
So you guys worked together for a couple of years back in the day?
Oh, I think more than that. I mean, there was a period of time. I was at Salt for 17 years, and I think Caroline, at least 3 vintages, worked 3 or 4 of those, and then my time involved at Wolf Blass Winery, where Caroline was based. There's more years involved there. So yes, quite a span of time involving different brands, varieties, wine styles, and different roles for both of us across that time. But I guess we got to know each other pretty well, and certainly got to understand our different winemaking characteristics and strengths. Definitely.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. And we don't want to leave poor Stewie out. So Stewie, how are you, mate?
Fantastic, mate. Living the dream.
You're all good. Do you want to, again, give everyone just a bit of an introduction on who you are and how you got into the industry, etc.?
Sure. Well, obviously, right now, Stuart Bourne, winemaker, 4 men in a shed, for Naked Wine. So hello to all the angels, and obviously thanks so much for all the great support we've been getting, in particular of late, which shows the strength of the angel base. So a little bit like Caroline, I was a hospitality boy going through university, did a pharmacology degree. I wanted to discover an amazing amount of therapeutic drugs that would add value to the world. And at the end of the pharmacology degree, I couldn't even get a job washing test tubes because you needed an honours degree to do that, obviously. And a buddy of mine had just finished at Roseworthy. He'd done the craft, he'd done the winemaking, and he said, well, look, science is one thing, hospitality is another thing. And at that point in our life, Mum and Dad were grape growers in Clare. So, had sort of seen the grape growing side, the hospitality side, and somewhere in between the start of the story and the end of the story was winemaking. So went back to Roseworthy, did the winemaking degree, came out, and then I was probably one of the luckiest bastards on the planet because I got mentored by some pretty amazing people along my journey, like I think we all did. But I think when Caroline and I had come out, obviously, Nige, not being rude, you come out a bit before us, but when Caroline and I had come out of the education side of winemaking, the industry, like Nige referred to, was in quite a bit of turmoil in terms of change and brands and the like, but there was lots of opportunity. So we came out into an industry that was crying out for young winemakers who graduated to team up with older winemakers who'd been there for a while and be that sort of industry succession. So I was pretty lucky. I ended up in WA, in the Perth Hills, came across to back to Clare where Mum and Dad were. I got to hang out with the likes of Robert Crabtree, Jeff Grossett, David O'Leary, Richard Rowe, Kerry Thompson. So I hung out in Clare for a while, went across to Victoria, to Blue Pyrenees for a little while. By the way, if you ever want to know how hard it is to be a Port Adelaide supporter in the middle of central Victoria, go to Blue Pyrenees and fly the Port Power flag and see how you go. Obviously got chased out of town, eventually finished up there, ended up in the Barossa with BVE, and that's when I met the cooperative. That's when I fell in love with the Barossa, because I was handed the reins to 80 grape growing families in the Barossa who were originally the old Kaiser Stuhl cooperative. They morphed into a revamped version of that cooperative. They went into cahoots with Hardy's. Barossa Valley Estate was born. Colin Glaitzer, obviously the first winemaker there, so there's a name for you. Followed by Fiona Donald and Tash Mooney, and I got to put my boots next to their boots at the front door. And I had 10 years at BVE, and that's where I met the parishes of the Barossa. And literally, here I am 20 Barossa vintages later, very much a Barossa boy. And even though I'm first generation, very much consider myself a local.
Wow, amazing. I mean, all three of you have sort of said how you love the Barossa and you wouldn't want to leave the Barossa. Why? What's so good about the Barossa? Tell everyone why.
Well, I could start. Having been here, I didn't spend all my life born here and then came back post studies. Well, two levels. As a region, as an agricultural region, it's actually a really nice place to live. I won't go into that, but I've raised, with my wife Stephanie and I, raised 3 kids here, and they've done very well and enjoyed every minute of the being part of the community. And it's a great community. Location to Adelaide or proximity to Adelaide is terrific. So, that aspect's very positive. But, to this topic, the winemaking aspect is really, really important. I mean, it's a big industry here. It's not broadacre, but it's big, as complex. As Stuart alluded to earlier, if you look at the generations of grape growers, the complexity of their vineyards, the complexity of the soils of the Barossa, and the history of the Barossa, all that tapestry and weave sort of adds up to, for us winemakers, you know, just something that is really, really interesting to work with. And not just interesting, but it does provide continuing high quality, and we're continuing to improve the quality of Barossa wines. It's not static. You know, across my time, I've seen massive changes and massive improvement in our winemaking, and they'll continue to happen, I'm quite sure. But
is there a particular reason for that?
It is viticulture. I can remember back to the mid-80s vine pool, which was a pretty turbulent and stressful time in the Barossa history. Essentially, it was a government initiative to allow non-productive vineyards to essentially go out of production. There's probably a better word for it, but there was a sponsored reduction. Now, we did lose a lot of iconic vineyards in that process. It was inevitable that it happened. However, we lost a lot of unviable, unwanted vineyards, things like Palomino, Pedro, Gordo, varieties that just weren't relevant to the market then and the market of the future. What happened was then, of course, the replacement of those areas of vineyard with Shiraz, Cabernet, some Grenache, other plantings, even the introduction of some more exotic things, the Spaniards, etc. And not just new plantings, but new plantings in a much better managed fashion. Irrigated vines, trellis vines, more productive vines, and even vines that could be managed to a high quality. This was the start of the regeneration of the Barossa, right. And it's continuing.
Yep.
Very much so. We're seeing, you know, a lot of initiatives in irrigation and water availability, always an issue. Expansion of different districts, very exciting. We're opening up different areas, and we're seeing the redevelopment of some old areas and the retention of those iconic old vines at the same time. So it's all there.
Cool. Caroline or Stuart?
Yeah, I think there's also, as well as the, you know, obviously a lot of what Nigel's saying with the viticulture has happened because of the change in people's tastes and the market as well. And I think, you know, some of the very traditional Barossa wines, I know, like when I was studying in Adelaide, and I was right at the tail end of Roseworthy College and the beginning of Waite, so I kind of had a little bit of both. And my only thoughts when I left college was, I don't want to work in the Barossa and I don't want to work for a big company. And that's exactly what I ended up doing, both of those. And my main reason at that time for not wanting to work in the Barossa was, I think there was a bit of a feeling at that stage that the Barossa only made kind of big, heavy, old-fashioned sort of red wines. And I think that's really turned around now. And even though you can't, you know, you can't avoid the fact that it's a relatively warm climate in the Barossa compared to, you know, some areas of Victoria, Tassie or whatever. So you're going to get lots of generous fruit character there. But I think what we've learnt now is how to sort of tame that and, you know, using, I think in the earlier days, it was like big fruit. So let's give it lots of big American oak as well. That sort of thing. And it just made a big wine bigger. And I think now we're sort of looking at using more older oak, more French oak, those sorts of things, and some wines with no oak at all. And getting a wine that's a little bit more refined, I suppose, even though it's still, you know, got plenty of that generosity and fruit flavour and everything that Barossa does so well.
Yeah.
And I think we're also sort of being a little bit more selective stylistically, because in the Barossa we're recognising how different all the sub-regions are in the Barossa, and the different soil types and different microclimates and things like that, and that you can get a very different style of wine from Lindok in the south, for example, compared to, you know, Ebenezer in the north or something. They're very, very different styles of wine, and I think there's a lot more focus on that sort of thing, and that there's not just one big Barossa Shiraz anymore. It's like lots of different ones. Yeah, so I don't know if Stu wants to add something to that too.
No, I think to touch on both your points, to me, why the Barossa is very simple. There's three key points to me. There's history, there's evolution, and there's community. And obviously the history of the Barossa, the grape growing, the agricultural side of it, dating back to the 1840s when those first Lutheran families arrived into the Barossa, who'd come from Silesia. They were fleeing persecution, the poor buggers, and they came out to something they didn't really know anything about. They arrived, they settled, and they started to build the framework for the Barossa. So that historical aspect to the Barossa is such a beautiful set of stories. Of course, as South Australians, we need to constantly remind the rest of Australia that you didn't need a police record to get into South Australia. We were all very proudly, free settlers. You got your police record when you got here. You didn't need one to get in. Then you've got that sense of evolution that Nigel was touching on, that, and also Caroline, when she talks about she didn't want to be part of the Barossa in those days, but look where the Barossa's gone and is going. So, just last week I was out with a grower who's received a small grant through the Primary Industry South Australia crew, looking at mulching and water retention in their soils to try to not only be smarter growers, but be more quality focused and use their water sparingly. So here's a 5th generation grape growing family where grandpa would have rotary hoed the living daylights out of the soil, and now the sons today are not touching their soil and being very mindful with their water. So here's 6 generations that are constantly showing evolution. And that's another set of stories for the Barossa. And the last one that Nigel used, the term community. It is an amazing community in the Barossa. And I don't just mean the agriculture, viticulture, winemaking community, because that is, I would say, one of the most cohesive, supportive communities within winemaking anywhere in Australia, if not the world, where if your tractor craps itself, guaranteed your neighbour will be around there tomorrow and lend you theirs. When things go wrong, you ring your neighbour and they help. It's a very cohesive community, but it goes outside winemaking. Community is walking down the main street of your town, recognising faces, saying hello to people, being part of small country towns that are linked by not just viticulture and winemaking, but by tourism, hospitality, and all the support services that go with that. The Barossa, as just a geographical location, is such a beautiful part of the world to live, because you honestly feel part of a caring community.
Very nice.
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of you guys mentioned the age of the vine and the vine pull scheme, et cetera, et cetera. Can you, what does old vine mean? How old is old?
Good question, Mark. There is now a charter that's been developed by the Barossa winemaking viticultural community. Stuart might know the exact detail of that, but I think the definition of old is, Stu, 15 plus?
At
35.
At 35, you can call yourself old vine, and then there's various stages which take you all the way past you know, centenarian and survivor for some of these incredibly old
yeah.
wines.
Yeah, so there is a gradient because the term old vine has been used, let's say, a little loosely, so it needed some definition. So I think that's the accepted, and that's probably about right. A 35-year-old vine is certainly more than mature. It's certainly reached its close to reaching its quality and crop potential. Its root zone would be established, its canopy would be established, and it is what it is. Then it's going to just grow older and older, and ultimately probably denigrate as well. But that's absolutely the term we use now.
And why is old vine good?
Well, the simple thinking is that older vines produce perhaps not as much abundance of fruit as younger vines do. Their energy isn't quite as great as a growing vine. When I say an immature vine, I might be talking years 5 to 10. Beyond that, the vines do sort of settle down a little bit. Their crop levels do reduce a bit, and hence the concept that with a reduced crop level, there'll be more concentration of flavour, aroma, and content in that package of crop, and as a consequence, a higher quality wine.
Right.
And that certainly can very much be the case.
And
I had a beautiful quote was given to me one day in the Brauhaus Hotel front bar pole, where an old grape grower said to me that old vines in the Barossa are old for a reason. They make good wine. If they didn't make good wine, they wouldn't be old vines. They would have been torn out and replanted to another variety or another cultivation technique, or they grow carrots or something different.
sure.
So really, old vine is not just about a quality of wine today. It's a consistent quality year after year, which is why we as winemakers get our growers to keep these old vines, because they just make good wine.
Good point.
Fantastic. So we've talked about Shiraz. I think people sort of understand that Shiraz does well in the Barossa. Do we briefly just touch on why it does well in the Barossa, and then discuss what else does well in the Barossa?
Well, Shiraz, having made a lot of them from a lot of vineyards, I think, and not always good, mostly. I think the climate, firstly, Shiraz is a warm area varietal. It doesn't, to make the style of wine the more generous, flavoursome, darker fruited version of Shiraz that we know as the Barossa version, it does require a warmer climate to just get those grapes ripe. And to Caroline's earlier point, not necessarily overripe, that's very important, but just to get that ripeness and depth of character into the fruit. The climate is perfect for that. It allows the fruit to ripen reasonably early. We're now ripening in sometime in February, perhaps into the middle of March. It's not late ripening, so we're not suffering from cold conditions, defoliation or any disease issues. They're not really a problem. And then the soils is the other issue, which vary across the Barossa, but generally they're ancient soils and they're not particularly fertile. So we're not getting high crop levels. And that combined with a restricted amount of water availability, and as Stu said, today's modern grape growers being very careful about their water usage, that generally keeps our crop levels to a pretty restrained, in fact, in some cases, pretty marginal level. And again, that does suit Shiraz in that it enables a looser bunch, it enables smaller berries, an even set and even ripeness. So we do get good darker fruit characters and even ripeness, which is then, we don't get those green harsh tannins, we get soft plush tannins and good colour, of course. So climate, soils, crop level, you know, perfect for Shiraz.
Guys, any other varieties that you think do well in the Barossa?
We've started experimenting, as the Angels would have seen over the last few years, with Graciano and Montepulciano. And it was a very brave move for one of our growers to take that risk and to put in something a little bit, you know, left of centre. Obviously, the research that we'd done on those two varieties showed that historically they came from warm climates, and obviously we're trying to match climate with climate. You wouldn't grow a variety from Europe that was renowned for a cool climate in the Barossa being so warm. So it's all small batch trial at the moment, but what we are finding is differences in ripening patterns, as Nigel alluded to. You know, the Shiraz is coming in early to midway through the harvest, and we're never having to worry about will it get ripe. More the concern is, can we get it off at the right time? And so with Graciano ripening much later and Montepulciano, it's giving us a chance to focus on the Shiraz when it comes in, wait a couple of weeks, and then we can focus on some other varieties that are then starting to come in. So everything's getting the right amount of love and attention when it comes in. And I think the early days of some of these other, what they call the emerging Mediterranean or Mediterranean varieties, I think there's some pretty exciting work to be done there. And of course, if you go up into the back of the Eden Valley, you've got Riesling country that will make you cry. It's just so beautiful because of the elevation, the poor granitic soils and that slightly colder bit. But I'd be interested to hear what Caroline would also then say to something that's old, that's new again with Grenache.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, those are Grenache. Stuart's talking more about the new emerging varieties. They're new and emerging here. They're not new and emerging, you know, in Europe and where they've come from, Mediterranean climates. But I guess the most traditional varieties that we've got in the Barossa are, and some of the oldest vines, as well as Shiraz, are Grenache and Mataro. And, you know, there are some really significantly old vines from both of those varieties. A lot of bush vines. So the bush vines are...
what sort of age, Caroline? Sorry, just to throw some values out there.
There are vineyards that are sort of up to 100 years old, 80 to 100 years old, some of the old bush vines and things. There's, you know, there's particularly with those varieties, they were originally, and also Shiraz, were originally planted for fortifieds. And so they were used in fortified production. And but now, obviously, those vines are the ones that escape the vine pool. Sorry about my dog. They escape the vine pool, but they're that they have sort of developed from being ones that were originally in that fortified style. Maybe the wines were made into fortified styles to now being made into reds. And as these become more and more popular varieties, instead of being considered those sort of more old-fashioned varieties, they're clearly making very good red wine styles. And those all three of those varieties, Shiraz, Grenache, and Mataro, are all traditional southern Rhone varieties or north and southern Rhone varieties. And so those kind of blends of those wines, because particularly when you're talking about this sort of southern Rhone, you get those blends that those varieties tend to work really well together. And so a lot of that has, over the last, I guess, you know, 15 years or so that people have been sort of making a lot more of those sort of blends. But I think, I mean, for me personally, with the wines that I make, I actually, I love those old vines made in a more modern style. I guess that's sort of the way I like to do them. And so I quite like the sort of quirkiness of those varieties on their own as well, you know, and they do extremely well in blends. And, you know, like in the Shiraz Grenache or Shiraz Grenache Mataro blends, GSM blends, they all sort of have their place in that blend. And, you know, Shiraz has got a little bit more concentration and richness of fruit. You get this really lovely sort of juicy fruit and sort of soft juicy fruit from Grenache, and then you get spice coming through from Mataro and a bit of structure and things. But for me, I like to see them on their own as well, and I think they stand alone really beautifully. And they're kind of really interesting wines that you don't see, particularly Mataro is not one that you see very often on its own. And just to be clear, in case anyone watching doesn't know, Mataro and Mourvèdre are the same variety. They're just different names for the same variety. So, and also Monastrell is another name for it. So often with those GSM blends, it's called Mourvèdre, but when we're talking about Mataro, we tend to call it Mataro in the Barossa, and that's the same variety. So Grenache and Mataro, Spanish varieties, Rhone varieties, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think there's some really, really interesting vines around the place, really lovely old vines, lots of character, lots of spice in those, and really lovely, interesting fruit. They're not big wines, but they're, again, they've got that generosity of Barossa fruit flavour without being sort of really big, heavy wines.
Is that because Grenache is typically a lighter variety than the Shiraz? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, even when you see it on the vine, the fruit on the vine, a Grenache, bunch of Grenache doesn't have that really. Shiraz has got really small berries and then very dark skinned. So you get a really high proportion of skin to pulp in the berry. So when it's made into wine, you're getting a lot of colour, a lot of tannin, that sort of thing. And it starts off as a dark colour. Some of them, you know, depending on the clone and where it's grown and things, some of them can be almost black in the vineyard. Whereas Grenache is a lot lighter and a lot bigger. They're much bigger berries, so there's more juice in there rather than skin. And the skins don't have as much tannin and they don't have as much colour. So you tend to get a lighter wine colour-wise and weight-wise from Grenache than you do with Shiraz. Which is not to say that it's insipid in any way, because it's still got plenty of fruit and plenty of flavour. It's just a different style.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about GSM. So how is that made? How do you put a GSM wine together? Is it grown together and you just chuck it into a big pot, or do you have to blend it, or how does it happen?
Well, generally they don't ripen at the same time, unfortunately. So I don't know about, you know, Stu might want to talk about his GSM blend, but with Dolan Dunn, with the Shiraz Grenache, Shiraz ripens earlier than Grenache. So we do ferment those separately and then blend it together. And then what we're looking for is that lovely balance that you get between those two varieties, that you get that really lovely, juicy, silky, soft Grenache fruit with the sort of bigger, more robust, I guess, bolder flavours of Shiraz, and you end up with a beautifully balanced wine. Mataro is quite late ripening as well. So I don't know, Stewie, whether you blend yours together in ferment or after.
Caroline, I just jumped in there. Just one more
approach. We see our GSM very much the same way that you would see your Shiraz Grenache or Nigel when you've been blending over the years in the Barossa, that if you're making single variety wines, they're still going to be blended across different vineyards, but when it comes to a blended varietal wine, such as the GSM that we do, it all starts with componentry pieces that are batch fermented because, as Caroline alluded to, they ripen at different times. So if the Grenache is ripening late and it's picked late, and the Shiraz is ripening a bit earlier, and the Mataro could be anywhere in between. And to the point on the old vines, some of these old Mataro vines that we've seen in the last few years, 134 years old is the oldest Mataro we're dealing with at the moment. It is this relic,
Wow.
but still sits there and produces a crop every year. So with the GSM, we'll make small batches of Grenache, we'll make small batches of Shiraz, we'll make small batches of Mataro, and then probably after 6 to 12 months maturation in the barrel, we'll start to look seriously at what does a blend look like. And if we use the analogy that the final bottle is just a jigsaw puzzle, and what are jigsaw puzzles made out of? They're made out of pieces. And all those pieces will be these individual batches you made along the way, and you let them mature for a little while by themselves, and you came back 6 to 12 months later and said, right, I know what the blend needs to look like. What's the puzzle? What are the pieces? How do we put it all together? And that, as the French would say, assemblage, the assembly of the wine, is one of the hardest things that we do as winemakers every year in trying to find that balance that Caroline was talking about, where the Grenache is juicy and soft and spicy with very light tannin, but the Shiraz is boisterous and it's big and it wants to play and it wants to get in your face. And the Mataro is that weird kid at the party sitting back in the background, just being a bit quirky, being a bit funky and cool, but you need them to come and play as well. So the interplay of the three and the way the blend comes together, I think, is one of the greatest arts we've got available to us as winemakers, where the science is the fermentation, but the art is the blend.
Mark, I'd just add to that, and I agree with both Caroline and Stu's summation of how that works, and that's exactly the way I've always approached it. But the other thing which is significant that I add to that discussion is the importance of individual parcel maturation is also the oak regime maturation. But, you know, Grenache can be delicate, can be a little bit more restrained and not as robust as Shiraz. Therefore, you need pretty careful consideration as to what oak profile you're going to use. Yeah, indeed, if any oak at all, or the period of oak that it should go into. You don't want to overwhelm that more delicate style with oak that, you know, perhaps longer in, that can be held longer with Shiraz, and Mataro is somewhere in between. So yeah, it's best to let that maturation sort of take its course, manage that, and then look at the assemblage that Stuart's talking to. I do agree with the jigsaw analogy. I actually probably look at it more like building blocks, because I see wine more as three-dimensional. So it's building up a little Lego puzzle with your componentry to get a complete package at the end. Yep.
So it's obviously a learned skill of having to be able to put all these parts together and create the wine that you think is best.
Skill, art, luck, experience.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have got it wrong, or you know, that can happen. But no, you know, I guess over time you develop a confidence and an understanding of these individual vineyards and how they will behave and mature as wines. And then you can start to really craft the blend together once you do have that experience and feeling for these wines.
I think that's a really good point that you make there, Nigel, about the consistency of these Barossa vineyards year in, year out, with a warm climate, with low humidity and a wonderful consistency. And yeah, look, sure, there's a bit of vintage variance from year to year, but in a warm, dry climate, our vintage variances are nowhere near that you would see in other regions around the world that are cooler or higher rainfall or more humidity. So you've got a consistency of vineyard, and I think, you know, with Nigel, with so many years under the belt of Barossa, he's got this inherent feel for that a certain vineyard and a certain family will always take its place in a certain blend. So that could be a backbone parcel, and then there'd be another family that he'd know where it might be one of those sort of swinging parcels where one year it might come into a blend, but in another year it might not fit into the blend. But when you deal with these growers, these families, these vineyards year after year, it's not recipe winemaking where you say that will always do this, but you get that gut feel that says, I know what this block's capable of. I've seen it for so many years, and I know where there's a wonderful home for it in a blend.
Correct.
Right. I've got a question here from Alan Hume, who says, having so many variables at your disposal, such as grape types, weather, environmental conditions, how do you decide what you're going to buy and blend? Do you take much direction and advice from trusted growers or other winemakers? Who influences you most?
I could definitely say to that I've got 23 grape growing families over the last 6 years that I've been working with 4 men in a shed. And prior to that, I had 80 grape growers in the cooperative for Barossa Valley Estate, and also my time I spent at Chateau Tanunda. It's dealing with pretty much the families you want to deal with year after year after year. So I take the approach of, rather than be variant every year in where you source your fruit, try to be stable. And that's not just about the stability of the wines I'll put out for Angels year after year to get the consistency, but it's also the relationship with the grower, that if you've got a grape growing family that's going to feed their family from the fruit they grow, they need some consistency. They need to know that every year Nigel's going to come in and buy a small parcel of fruit from their block, and Caroline's going to come in and buy a small parcel of fruit from their block, and I'm going to come in and buy another small parcel from their block, and that pretty much between us all, we can cover their vineyard, cover their crop, and be there for them in the long run.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that sort of almost taking a step back from what Stewie's saying, that I think you develop those relationships with those growers based on the style of wine that you want to make. And so looking around the Barossa, for example, the wines that I make, the Shiraz that I make, comes out mostly out of the Light Pass area, which is a very kind of very fragrant wines that are a little bit more elegant. They get a lot of sort of cooler breezes coming down from the foothills and the gully breezes and that sort of thing. So you get this sort of slightly more elegant style of Shiraz, whereas, for example, out in the sort of, so that's on the eastern side of the Barossa. If you're looking towards the western side of the Barossa, for example, Penfolds wines are coming out of that area a lot, and you're getting a lot more sort of a lot more tannin finish, and obvious sort of tannin finish. They're a little bit more, they're slightly tougher wines, I guess. So a little bit more muscly, and you know, so you're kind of looking at that style of where you have traditionally wanted to find the style that you get, and then you find those growers and you build up those relationships, and you just keep going back to those ones because they're the ones that support the style that you want to make. So I guess that's sort of where it starts from, and then you're building those relationships with those growers. and you know, I think all of us would agree that that's really important for us to maintain that style. Then is to maintain that relationship with the grower and to keep those relationships going from year to year, so that as much as possible we're getting the same fruit coming through and being able to create the same style. And obviously every year is slightly different, but you're still getting a similar style coming through in your wines.
You mentioned your Shiraz from Caroline, read by Caroline Dunn. You have a new Shiraz coming out with Nigel.
Yep.
Can you explain the difference, perhaps, or you know, the similarities, if there are, between that wine or those two wines?
Yep, and because they do come from very different areas, and the wine that I get, the Shiraz that I make from for read by Caroline Dunn is, as I said, it's all from the Light Pass area. It's predominantly from one vineyard, but not all from one vineyard, but in the same area, which is on that eastern side of the Barossa, and it does make that slightly more fragrant style, and it's almost a slightly, it's heading into the, it's close to the Angoston area. If you sort of went one step further on, you're going into Angoston and then into Eden Valley, and each step is getting a little bit cooler, but you're into that sort of cooler side of the Barossa. Whereas the new one that Nigel and I have it's just been released a week ago on the Naked Wine site, and that's the Dolan Dunn. It's actually a single vineyard wine that comes from a long-term grower in the Barossa, Peter Sontag. So the Sontag family in the Barossa is, you know, very, I guess, Barossa royalty a bit in the sense of great growers, and that comes from the Stonewall area, which is more towards Tanunda, that area of the Barossa, and it tends to give probably not quite as fragrant. It's a little bit more darker fruits, quite sort of inky colour and darker fruit flavours. Lots of sort of blackberry, those sorts of characters coming through there, and not quite as sort of tannic and firm as something that you might get out further west in on the Western Ridge, or out at you know, those sort of more traditional Penfold sort of areas. But it's sort of something in between, I guess. So you may know Stonewall area from Peter Lehman, Stonewall, Shiraz, that sort of thing. So it's yeah, I guess it's probably not quite as elegant as the read by Caroline Dunn. It's a slightly different style, but it's not a big, heavy, tough wine. It's still quite soft, but has that richness to it and a darker fruit flavour. And yeah, I don't know if that's answered the question well enough. But more questions if I haven't, I'm happy to address it.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Okay, well, I've got a couple of more questions here. This is from Malcolm Norris. It's for Stewie. Can you tell the story behind the name Four Men in a Shed?
Four Men in a Shed. I think, being a fairly simplistic bloke, Four Men in a Shed is fairly evident that if you come round to our winery, you'll find a shed and four blokes in it, pretty much unsupervised, with a forklift, a dog, some step ladders, and about 800 barrels. So what could possibly go wrong with four blokes in a shed unsupervised? Literally, I still remember the day, Paul, that you and I sat in the Tanunda Clubhouse, which is, for anyone who's ever been to the Barossa, it's an institution, and you know, things we're famous for in the Barossa, schnitzels. We do schnitzels pretty well. And you and I sat down over a schnitzel, and I was trying to explain to you what the boys and I were doing in the shed, and you was going, yeah, okay, four guys making wine, and yeah, I kind of get it, but I don't get it. And I remember looking at you saying, well, what's not to get? It's four men in the shed. And the light went on for both of us over that schnitzel. and you said, that's it. I see what you are. And literally over a schnitzel in the front bar of the Tanunda Clubhouse between you and me and the other boys, 4 Men in a Shed for Naked Wines was born. And I think, when you look at the history of brands, I mean, this is not a, 4 Men in a Shed hasn't been around for 2,500 years, like some of these other French, brands claim to be. But when you sit down, you share a meal, you share a glass of wine, you have a laugh, and look what we created together for Naked Wines for all the Angels. There's 4 Men in a Shed. Come round and have a look one day. It's for any of the Angels coming through the Barossa, it's pretty simple, but so are the 4 blokes that make the wine.
Good one. Malcolm asks, there's a stack of corporate experience between the 3 of you. Given your current naked experience, would any of you be tempted to return back to the big players?
I can start on that one. No, that's not happening. The rest of my winemaking years will be spent very happily doing as I'm doing now with Caroline. Too much I've spent already.
Pretty unanimous answer, I think.
I'd have to add though that I think it's an invaluable experience working in those bigger companies. I mean, it doesn't conjure up the most romantic image of winemaking to say that you're working for a corporate winemaker, but it's an incredible grounding to have as a winemaker. The access that you have to vast amounts of different fruit, lots and lots of different palettes that you've got people to bounce ideas off and learn from, and all that sort of thing. And just as Stewie was talking before about blending, learning that ability to blend when you're blending and selecting literally from hundreds of different parcels of wine to create certain products at the end. It really is an amazing grounding.
Yeah, can I just add in there, and I totally agree with Caroline on that point, and also it does provide, or there is a definite discipline involved in a corporate environment, which is important. It does help in being able to actually produce ultimately good quality wines, which is what you have to do. And it teaches you how to do that. It teaches you to keep on page with doing that. There is a discipline. And I think I have seen in my past some winemakers who've not had exposure to that discipline perhaps not make wines which I personally would be very proud of. So there is value in that structure, but yeah, it's much more fun doing it our way now.
We've done that. We don't need to do it anymore.
And I think the other thing that you'd both agree with me on is that great point about the discipline, Nigel. It teaches you to be disciplined. It also teaches you to look for a consistency year after year, that if you've got a customer that loves a wine from a certain vintage, the best thing you can do for them is the follow-up vintage is up there with it. It might be slightly different, but it's still of a quality that it can stand what you did last year. So that consistency of year to year, producing good quality wine is a training that the corporates were really good at teaching, I think, all 3 of us. The exposure to wines to benchmark against when you're part of a large company. We all got to taste some extraordinary wine from around the world, and to put it into context, that final thing, and let's face it, for an angel out there who's part of the Naked Wines family, there's one other thing that we need to touch on, and that's value. And value has a dollar component. That you can buy wines through Naked Wines, through the 3 of us and through all the other, the 50-odd winemakers at Naked Wines, where if you put those wines at that price up against others of similar price, that the value proposition they get is extraordinary. And one thing that Nigel and Caroline and I were all taught within the corporate world in our early days of winemaking is making wine is a beautiful thing. Making great wine is a better thing. But making wine to a price and a value proposition is everything.
Very interesting. Very interesting. We've got probably a final question here. This is from Michelle, who asks, how is the Barossa adapting with advancing climate change? And are there any varieties we might see more or less of in the future? Anyway.
Well, more than happy to have a crack. Okay, adaptations. I think we alluded to a couple of them before, that clever use of water, because water is a precious resource. Remember, South Australia is the driest state on the driest continent on the face of the earth. So water is one of our greatest commodities. Clever use. And if climate changes to the point where it becomes warmer and water is harder to get, we adapt with it. We're growing varieties that are very much drought tolerant to start with. So as the world gets warmer or drier, we are in a better place to adapt than if we were growing varieties that were not suited to a dry climate. But I just think in terms of how we're adapting, we're also now starting to look at some of these other drought tolerant varieties. And I've got a wine coming out at some stage soon as another experimental batch for the Angels, which is a Counoise Carignan field blend, where we've got a grower to put a small trial plot of Counoise and Carignan, both of which are very much adept in warm climates. This wine is, I think it might freak a few people out because it's not a rosé, it's much heavier, but it's not a GSM. It's a lot lighter. It's a very vibrant, light purple. It's going to be released in the year of production. So I think, how is the Barossa dealing with climate change? We're sticking to what we know, which is drought tolerance. We're sticking to what we know, which is clever use of water, but we're still evolving where we're pushing the boundaries on what else could we do that would be adapted.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that as we've talked about, as far as blending and things go, it's very important to have that depth of experience, because one of the most important decisions that we make as winemakers is when we pick the fruit. And it's been quite evident to all of us that over the last 20 years in the Barossa, the ripening patterns have changed because of the climate. It then falls on us to make the right decisions based on what the weather's doing that year, and every year is different. I mean, we used to have some semblance of what was a normal vintage. Well, normal doesn't even come into it anymore. So we just have to adapt, and having that sort of depth of experience behind you helps you to be able to go out into a vineyard and say, look, I know what the weather's going to do in the next 10 days. I know it's going to be 40 degrees, so I want to get that off beforehand, or it's going to rain, or it's going to do whatever. And I think all those things, we just have to adapt to those. At the moment, we're not at a point where we're saying, okay, we can't grow wine in the Barossa, we can't grow grapes for wine in the Barossa at this stage. We haven't got to that point. We're just at that point where we're managing the year-to-year changes and the week-to-week changes and day-to-day changes. So, there are obviously, some of the cooler regions are starting to get warmer around Australia, but we're certainly not at a point where we can't grow quality grapes. We just need to know how to manage it.
Yeah. Mark, what I'd say to that is, I can remember 40 years ago, my then viticultural lecturer, who was a very clever man, Dr. Richard Smart, actually said to me, in 40 years, he was a bit of a doomsdayer on climate change. He said, in 40 years, the Barossa won't exist. Well, 40 years later, we do exist, and we will adapt, and we will continue to exist. So we're okay.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I think that's about it. Thank you so much, all three of you, for sharing all your insights. Any final remarks you want to leave the Angels with?
Only thank you for enjoying our wines and participating tonight. Great pleasure.
Yeah.
And thank you for giving us the ability to be able to directly communicate with the Angels, because under the normal principle of go to the bottle shop, buy a wine, and you've got no idea who's behind it. Through Naked, the Angels get to talk to us, and so Caroline and Nigel and I are able to sit down and say, hey, thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you so much, Steve. Real people. We're able to touch real people that touch our wine. That's something that I just can't put a value on myself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that it feels like we've only really just scratched the surface. So I'm sure we're all happy to come back and do it again sometime. So thanks for having us, guys.
Yeah.
No worries. Thank you very much, Angels. Cheers. We'll see you next Thursday. Ta-da.